And I also want to introduce our speaker today, Dave Williams. So Dave is a solution director here at Analytics 8. Dave has spent over 20 years in IT and advises his clients on how to address their business challenges using data and technology. And with that, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Dave.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. Hello, everyone. As Tracy said, I'm Dave Williams, and I work, obviously, for Analytics 8. So as a firm, we're focused exclusively on analytics. Our main services include data architecture and strategy, data visualization and enterprise reporting, as well as advanced analytics and data science. So we support many clients on analytics and data science initiatives across many different industries. And we've helped dozens of organizations set a strategy for achieving their goals, assisted by analytics. And that's what we're here to talk about to you today. One of our clients, Educause, is one that's focused on the higher education space. And we've worked with them, help build out some of their internal reporting as well as their analytics architecture. And also some of their offerings that they offer to their members, such as CDS, or their core data service, and eTracks as well. We're headquartered out of Chicago, but have offices all over the country, including Minneapolis, which is where I'm based. So in terms of an agenda, we plan to talk about why a data strategy is beneficial, why it's necessary in today's world. And then we'll go into what a data strategy is. We'll define many of the key components. And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking about a roadmap in a data strategy. That we live in a data-centric world is not a surprise to anyone on this webinar. Data is everywhere. Universities create vastly more data than they know how to process, and it's coming in from hundreds of different sources, whether it's small data or big data, internal data or external data, maybe historical data, streaming data, IoT data. Many organizations, and businesses too, are getting caught up just trying to keep up, learning new tools and technologies, responding to requests from business stakeholders, maybe tracking down software licenses and preparing and scrubbing data. And with the pace of change within the field of analytics, in the past few years especially, trying to keep up seems like a fool's errand. And yet, leading organizations are separating the signal from the noise within their data. They're employing advanced techniques to accurately anticipate what's going to happen with their organization. So it is a mistake to think that all data is valuable, that all data is equal, because it's not. Not all data has been created equally. Not all data holds the promise of an insight. So when we talk about a data strategy, we orient it around what the business objectives are. A data strategy should exist only because the organization has those objectives. And the data strategy then defines into a single plan what the involved employees need in order to more effectively use data, what the processes required to ensure corporate data is high quality and accessible, and then also what the technology is that will enable the storage, the sharing, the analysis of data. So while a data strategy may sound technical, without a focus on people and process, it will fall flat. So a data strategy or an analytics strategy acts as the foundation to an analytics program. And we've helped many clients establish a strategy and prioritize projects according to that strategy to ensure that the path that they're on will help them achieve their long-term business goals. We approach each organization that we work with the business in mind. We don't do technology for the sake of technology. We understand how our technology efforts support our clients' mission and values. The exercise of creating a data strategy is one in which organizational leaders take an objective look at the business through the lens of data to anticipate what needs to happen to bring about the specific objectives that the company, the organization, maybe the department has defined. It answers the question of how can the organization leverage data in support of its business goals. And importantly, that it concludes with a plan that weaves all those elements together. The reason why a school or a university, an organization should set out on the road to create a data strategy are varied. For some, new leadership may bring a new value to what can be done with data. It might bring a new perspective. Or maybe existing leadership finally recognizes that they need to compete with a smarter approach. Or for some, there's a realization that the current piecemeal architecture won't support the organization's planned growth. For others, maybe a new SIS or LMS will be creating more detailed and more valuable data that will be able to be used for more analytics down the road. And finally, for others, demands from multiple business partners may lead to the need for a more comprehensive solution that a data strategy can provide. So with the organizations that we've worked with, each of them has a particular focus or a particular need, a particular problem that a data strategy is well equipped to help solve. All organizations should be looking at how they're meeting business requests, how they're fulfilling those requests. In particular, within analytics, the question is whether the analytics that are provided are appropriate based on the need or based on the use case. Gartner's analytic ascendancy model provides a helpful barometer. So note, this is not a maturity model. Each of these stages is appropriate for different use cases. The issue is when a use case requires a more sophisticated level, but that's not available and that's not provided. So we talk about descriptive analytics being a look at what happened. So what was the course completion rate, for example, or a diagnostic analytic, which is determining why something happened, such as why did the dropout rate spike in a certain month? Predictive analytics then looks at or tries to anticipate what's going to happen. And finally, the prescriptive analytics is going to suggest how to do something or how to bring about a particular objective. And with the data strategy, we lay out the plan to achieve each of these different levels, to these different types of analytics for each of the different use cases or each of the different needs that we uncover as part of the process. So next we can get into the different components of a data strategy. And so here we list business needs, gathering and sourcing data, technology infrastructure, turning data into insights, people, process, and data governance as all core or key components of a data strategy. And we'll look at each one of these in more detail. And then we'll look at how to build each one of those core components into a roadmap that, combined with the business case or a request for investment, will comprise the conclusion of building a data strategy. So as I mentioned earlier, the whole point of a data strategy is to plan the data capabilities in line with supporting the objectives of the business. So we start with an orientation towards business goals and objectives. We identify a champion of the effort. The champion is likely an executive, someone from upper management that's leading the charge on the effort. It's this person who will rally support for the investment, provide executive leadership, while stakeholders and other subject matter experts will represent specific departments or functions within the organization. Now, the organization's strategic goals should be identified and documented as part of this effort. Now, they likely already exist for the company or for the organization. Certainly they should exist, but they may not be documented. And if they are, they may not be tied to data or analytics. And so by starting with the gathering and the documenting of the business requirements, we overcome a roadblock to many IT or technical projects, which is knowledge of what the business is trying to accomplish in the first place. Sometimes these goals or objectives exist at the company level. Other times they're for a specific department. But the stated goals at every level should sync up. They should be in line. But ultimately, at the lower level, the goals at the lower levels of the organizations should certainly support goals at the higher level of the organization. So these objectives are most effectively gathered through an interview process that starts at likely the executive level or the upper management level, and then continues down through leaders of the departments that are included within the effort. And when we work with clients on building a data strategy, this assessment doesn't stop at only uncovering the high-level goals, but we get into some of the details of the common challenges and frustrations that all levels of the organization are currently experiencing. So another way to think about this is to think about asking the question about what the organization is trying to measure, or asking, what is the organization trying to improve upon? Another question or another prompt for this key component or core component is, what questions are business partners having trouble answering? So a data strategy for one of our clients resulted in a clear understanding of their key challenges, a sample of which is summarized here. So this client was troubled with their graduation rates and was also seeing a decrease in alumni giving over multiple years. We identified the improvements they wanted to make and converted these into questions the different business partners would be asking in support of reaching their goals. And finally, we worked with them to identify the metrics that would represent answers to the questions they were asking. Now, at this point, they couldn't provide the metrics, but we did have the definition for what would answer their questions. We had that common understanding that moving on through other core components of a data strategy, then we could flush out, we could fulfill. So once we identified those challenges and those business critical questions, the important KPIs that would represent answers to the questions, we moved on to the next core component of a data strategy. So at this point, we started analyzing the available data sources and how that data is gathered within the organization currently. Not just how is it gathered, but where does that data exist within the organization? For many organizations, all that data is not available actually within the organization. And if it is, it's unlikely that it already exists in a place that's accessible. So we need to work backwards to find the source for the data that we've identified that's required. For data that can be found in-house or within the organization, the source system and any roadblocks to getting access to that data are documented. Whether the data is at the right level of detail and whether the data is updated with the right frequency is also assessed. Some other common concerns that need to be analyzed and resolved as part of this effort include data quality issues and data cleanliness concerns. Maybe a lack of a common definition of ownership of the data meaning and usage. Whether the data is private, especially in light of GDPR and CCPA. Whether another concern is if the data is guarded by restrictions brought on by software licensing, and whether the data exists within the organization but hasn't been compiled in a central repository. So as part of inventorying this data, it's ideal to identify attributes about the data or metadata, such as its source, where does the data come from? Who in the organization owns that data or owns that source system? What transformations have been done to that data? And what is that data's recency? What is the history of change? And for data that isn't available, we'll just note that here. Note that there's a desire for a particular type of data, but that it's not available. And we'll pick that up then in the next step. So let's look at an example from one of our clients. So for one of our clients, we built a matrix that was admittedly more complex than this example. We identified the question the business partners wanted to ask. We understood the data needed to answer the question, and then we mapped each question, or excuse me, each data component to a source system. So identifying these questions and identifying these data sources then leads to additional questions. It leads to more detailed questions and better questions. We also, in this stage, very likely uncover some assumptions that the organization has been making for a long time that may no longer be accurate. And so now is a good time to identify these erroneous assumptions because it represents an issue that will need to be addressed at a later point. So note, it's not necessary to solve for the missing data at this point or to solve for some of those erroneous assumptions. This stage is more about taking an inventory of the data in the source systems. When the solution is constructed, then we'll account for the data that's deemed necessary but unavailable, and we'll resolve some of those conflicts. We'll clear up some of those assumptions that might be erroneous that we uncover here. The next stage then, or the next core component, requires involvement from our counterparts in IT. And this is specifically around building out the technology infrastructure. So our goal to build out a flexible and scalable data architecture is what this stage is, or what this component is all about. So it's a complex topic. There's many approaches, many options. So we'll just touch on a couple of highlights here, a couple of topics to consider. So one of the first things that we help guide our clients through is to what extent an operational system can support analytical needs. Likely, very little. It's generally not practice to rely on an operational system to meet analytical needs. So this likely means that a central data repository would be useful. And if that's the case, we ask the question about whether the organization has the skills and the technical infrastructure to support that repository or that data warehouse maybe in an on-premise environment, or maybe leveraging a cloud-based solution would make more sense. For data that we identified that would be nice to have or necessary, but doesn't exist within the organization today, we now solve for how that gap will be filled. How will we provide for that data? Maybe it can be calculated based on data that we do have, or maybe it can be estimated. Maybe it can be purchased from a third-party data provider. Or maybe a new source system can be implemented to generate that data. Another topic to consider is how to get the data from the source system into that central repository. Is there a standard data integration tool within the organization? And if so, will that layer of the architecture be leveraged for business logic so that data is ready to be used? How will access to the data be provisioned? Will IT create all the reports? Will software licenses be provided for anybody and everybody who asks for one? Will reports or dashboards, different metrics be embedded into different websites or maybe an internal intranet site? Or will data and reporting be provided to people outside the organization? Another topic to consider is how big is the data? How much data, how much volume is there? How quickly is it being generated? And how much variety is there in the data? And also, how structured is the data, or is it unstructured? All these considerations will go into an overall architecture. And as with most designs, the more requirements and future needs are taken into account, the more the solution will actually support the business and be able to grow with the business. So here's a conceptual diagram, an abstraction of the different types of analysis and storage and integration that need to be captured through either technology or process. An architecture diagram will identify and represent all the source systems, which we see on the far left, and the different options for ingestion and for storage, which we see in the middle. And then also it'll represent the different analytic solutions or kind of end user solutions, which are over on the far right. And then finally, it'll layer in, again, conceptually, processes like data governance and information security. So these diagrams are helpful tools in communicating and planning the overall architecture. On these diagrams, we might note what exists currently and what needs to be added. We can also denote external sources versus internal sources of data. And finally, it's important to indicate which tools will be used for the different types of storage, the different types of data ingestion or integration, and the different types of analysis. So these diagrams are particularly helpful in showing the incremental changes by phase for a strategy that has multiple stages or phases to its rollout. In other words, different versions of the diagram can incrementally demonstrate new capabilities and remove decommissioned capabilities and tools. So each of these areas, each of these boxes might be supported by different technologies. And so what's tricky is finding the right technology for each use. So whether it's real-time analytics or whether it's just a staging area, whether it's providing some data transformation and business logic application within that data ecosystem. And then finally, providing a layer that business users will actually interact with and be able to explore the data and work with it. So, and oftentimes where none of this environment or none of this architecture exists, we start small. We start with the basics, and we allow room to grow and mature. The next element of a data strategy is the presentation of data to the end users, using data to win insights. So currently, many old school methods exist to interact with and to share data. Many organizations still rely on Excel and email, or maybe a legacy BI tool that doesn't allow interaction with the data. Significant wrangling of data may also be required. Oftentimes, that's a tedious and manual process. Or maybe business relies heavily on IT, turning IT inadvertently into a bottleneck. So we talk about turning data into insights. There's an implied speed. There's an implied ease of use and an ability to interact with the data. And more, there's a reliance on the tool itself to suggest insights. So some factors that should be included when we talk about turning data into insights is the level of detail that's being presented, data granularity. So presenting too detailed information to an executive or too high a level of detail to an analyst are ineffective. So getting the right level of detail to the right audience is key. There's often a need to be able to interact with the data. For example, drilling into data to see why a particular high-level metric is the way that it is. Some users will need more control over the data that they have access to, and others will need to have only limited data available to them. Democratization of data refers to sharing data far and wide, enabling as many people as possible with data or with insights from data. However, it is possible to create more confusion by sharing too much data without enough context. This is also why having common definition and metrics across the organization is important. And we'll talk more about that a bit later in the conversation. Telling stories with data means leading the business user on a path to understanding why and how the core KPIs came to be by placing relevant data nearby and understanding what questions the user would ask to further understand those KPIs. And finally, visualizations. So would it be helpful to see the data in a more visual way, maybe to quickly spot trends and outliers? If so, what are the best practices for presenting data in a visual way? Of course, there's situations for which visualizing data is not ideal, such as some financial reporting or maybe building a balance sheet. And there are even some uses for Excel that make sense in a modern data architecture. But applying these best practices will undoubtedly improve the user experience. If we improve the user experience, then we increase engagement with the overall solution, which is one of the factors that we're after in terms of building a culture around data and analytics. So to emphasize the importance of data visualization, many modern reporting tools that are available will make data visualization very easy. And so again, if we can visualize that data, we can then help understand and communicate complex data. We can determine patterns in the data and ideally identify what action needs to be taken based on those patterns. We can also enable data discovery and self-service, which by itself will eliminate or at least reduce reliance on IT. So we remove the bottleneck that we've kind of put IT into, so that, again, we can get more analytics, more value into the hands of the business users. So let's start with an example, or let's look at an example, and we'll start with the way not to do it. Again, referring to data visualization. So it's common to see tables in reports. But if we look at the example of a box score of a basketball game in this case, so imagine you were trying to determine what happened in the game, in the basketball game. So looking at a box score can be a good start. You can tell who won, you can determine who contributed the most, you can see all the key metrics, and you'll get an idea for what happened during the game. But it does force the reader to, or the viewer, to read the data, to use their verbal system. So what if we tried to communicate the game's story using visuals or a dashboard? So if we pivot to a more modern representation of the game, the story of the game is told more clearly, and what's important is highlighted. So the arc of the game is visible to the game flow in win probability charts. And as a side note, a great example of usage of this type of visualization translated in the business world could be looking at actuals versus budget, right? Whether it's financial or time-based. But getting back to looking at the basketball game, that shows when the game turned. It shows when teams maybe went on a hot streak and when they were unable to score. And the rest of the charts here represent shot distribution and player and team metric comparisons. So we're focusing on what I think is most important as the creator here. We're not letting the user pick and choose the metrics, because the purpose is to explain what happened without leaving a lot of room for further exploration on different statistics and different information. So these visuals are pulled from ESPN.com, by the way, in case that's not obvious. All right, the next stage in creating a data strategy is looking at the people in the organization. So the data strategy is likely going to introduce a new way to do things that relies more on data and data analysis, and maybe new tools as well. Based on this, it makes sense to look at the skill sets of the people who will be using the tools to understand their strengths and where they'll need support. So we try to boost in-house talent and train everyone to use data effectively. And maybe new hires then are brought in that are more data-driven or more comfortable using data. The current organizational structure should also be looked at, because some changes may be recommended in order to prioritize roles that deal with data in a hands-on way. It should be decided if analysts should be aligned to business or to IT. And either way, we should decide how IT will support the business with their analytical needs. The size of the team should be analyzed to determine whether the current team has capacity to build the analytics roadmap, or alternatively, if the team should be supplemented by external resources. And even topics like employee reviews and incentive plans should be evaluated, since after all, those can be used as levers to encourage employees to use data in the way that the organization is intending. So we discussed enablement within the organization a minute ago. And for one of our clients, we built a training plan that included every level of the organization. When employees are handed new tools but not shown how to think differently about their jobs, the end result is unlikely going to change. And so it's not just new tools, but we found that providing training on topics like data literacy, data visualization do's and don'ts, and the new governance procedures that are being put in place has a much more positive effect in changing the culture than providing new tools and hoping for a different result. So in addition to helping this organization with employee enablement, we assisted them in identifying some other organizational changes, such as where their BI analysts should report. And we also helped them create a job description for a new role of a leader of their new business analytics group. So this client knew they needed to invest in people in order to move themselves or move their culture towards being more data-centric. So after people, we talk about process. Specifically, the processes related to creating, sharing, and governing data, the processes related to using data in a person's day-to-day work life. So typical organizations have unintentional roadblocks to not only getting access to the data, but to using the data in meetings and in decision-making. Those issues have to be identified and improved. And we can start to do that here as we're building out this component of the data strategy. So some business processes may need to be re-engineered to incorporate formal data analysis. These can get very detailed by documenting each role and each step in the process and where a specific report will be leveraged for analysis before a decision. Leaders can also mandate that specific data be provided as rationale for a business decision. So getting a quick win within the business that's based on a new use of data needs to be celebrated and promoted to build internal momentum and to build some positive peer pressure to those who may be holding on to the old way of doing things that provides them a lot of certainty, a lot of security in their day-to-day jobs. So here's a fictitious business process flow that demonstrates a process that touches multiple different groups with multiple points of analysis. You can see that there's 3 different points on this process that analysis is performed at, and decisions then are based after that analysis. And so this is an example or a sample business process flow that could be created where that specific metric or the specific data that's looked at as part of the decision is formalized and is mandated by leadership, and maybe additional proof of that data is provided with a particular decision. But there's lots of different ways to build in that formalization of using some analysis within a specific business process. So the next stage or the next component in a data strategy is data governance. And data governance means a lot of things, and it covers a lot of different areas. And while the term may not sound flashy or modern, the value it provides should far outweigh any bad connotations. So this is what ultimately allows enterprise-level sharing of data. The practice of data governance will ensure that, for example, calculations that are used across the organization are determined based on input from across the organization. Also, that the right people have access to the right data, and that data lineage, in other words, where the data originated and how it was transformed since that origination, will also be defined. So data governance has to happen. It's required in a modern and cross-functional data and analytics environment. Leadership and cross-departmental collaboration are necessary here. This is people work. We don't look to a tool or to some technology to solve data governance, even though tools can facilitate the process of data governance. This takes leadership, and often it takes navigating through some difficult and emotional conversations. Developing a data dictionary is a very good place to start. A data dictionary is a living document in which all end user measures and dimensions, all metrics, all KPIs, all data definitions that are centrally available are formally defined. There's often vigorous discussion about terms used within the organization. However, it's during these conversations that misunderstandings are identified and corrected. So, as I mentioned, data governance is a cross-department function. It's also a function that ideally spans multiple levels within the organization. One of our clients was lacking in any and all governance related to their data, and we got them started by helping them structure a data governance committee. So this client knew they needed something with respect to data governance, but they didn't know how to approach it. They didn't have the expertise, and they asked us to step in and establish and lead a data governance committee to help influence and align their team towards best practice. So we built the structure of the committee and facilitated weekly data governance committee meetings. First order of business was establishing that data dictionary that was continually modified and enhanced. Though we started off meeting weekly, the frequency of the meetings decreased over time. And we also eventually allowed executive members to send delegates in their place once the committee was on solid footing. One thing to note on this committee is the seniority of the committee members. Executives and senior leadership had a very significant role, and that lent a lot of credence and a lot of significance to what we were trying to do with this, or with data governance at this organization. We also recommended that responsibilities be added to people's jobs, specifically the line of business subject matter experts, because they would eventually become the departmental level go-to people with respect to data and data definitions. So identify or formalizing those roles within their job descriptions gave them more accountability, more seniority and significance within the organization. So moving on to the business case. So the business case is one of the other core components of a data strategy. And ultimately, what we're doing here is proving out the value to what the data strategy is intending to build, or the solution for building the analytics environment within the organization. So this business case is really geared towards executives and includes the cost and the return on investment, a timeline, and other values that we'll see here on the next slide. So anyone who has launched a new technology solution knows the bottom line is always, what will we get for our money? Intuitively, it might seem like there's only a small benefit to getting data to more employees. But after being burned by failed implementations in a finite pool of funds, it's critical that we're able to demonstrate hard and fast ROI to the executives that will be reviewing the business case. So if you've lived through a painful analytics implementation and have done due diligence on a modern BI solution, the statement that I made a second ago likely resonates. So when you talk to your executives or colleagues in finance, it's important to convey the costs, the benefits, and the return on investment in a language that they will understand. So a well understood and clearly defined business case that can show tangible value will make it much easier to get executive buy-in and buy-in from finance or from a PMO that will ultimately lead to a better defined plan for execution in a more straightforward way to track progress. So the first thing in a business, in building a business case that we need to do is identify whether there's even a need. So a lot of times if a BI tool, for example, is being sunset by the vendor, the situation may be deemed critical at the organization. And so a business case may not actually be required in that situation. But then in the case where a business case is required, it's important to start small, but ultimately think big. So we want to start with a process or with a project that is fairly simple, fairly approachable, fairly easy to document, easy to talk about, and that should have a fairly short timeline in terms of the start to finish, the duration from start to finish. That project should also be able to provide tangible results. So we look for benefits that can be articulated and measured. So in the situation where we're automating what is currently a manual process, we should be able to calculate or determine how much we're saving there in cost or in hours of effort. And then also the solution that we're intending to build should be intentionally scalable. It should be able to support growth for whether it's additional features, additional use cases, maybe new campuses, new data, new users, etc. And so here's, what ultimately looks a bit like a menu when we're building a business case of benefits, costs, and risks and assumptions. So these are some of the common benefits that we've seen when we work with our clients around building a data strategy or specifically building out that architecture for an analytic solution. So we mentioned automating a manual process is a common benefit, maybe consolidating BI tools to reduce costs or reducing technology, moving away from a dependence on a limited number of IT resources, maybe reducing printing costs or providing an ability to expand the types of analytics that an organization is able to use. And then we compare those benefits with the expected cost of the solution. So looking at hardware costs or maybe cloud hosting costs, software costs, both the upfront license fee as well as annual maintenance fees, external services from whether it's the vendor or third parties, training, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also kind of state some assumptions and state some risks that are going into our plan as well. So the number of users that we're expecting on the solution, how many years or how many months the benefits are going to be valid for. And so a couple other things there that we can look at as well in terms of risks and assumptions. So now that we've gone through all the different core components of a data strategy, it's time to build the roadmap. So this is where we put it all together. And the roadmap is really what we look to tie all those different components, all those different initiatives together. So whether it's the architecture of the solution, the data that will be built in, the business intelligence, or the BI layer, which is where we turn that data into insights, the training and enablement of the end users that will be required, data governance that we talked about. So each of those efforts should be represented on the roadmap. And so the roadmap then tells the story in chronological order of how the analytics environment will be built. I mean, this is the plan for building out the solution that we've identified, or that we're starting to plan for as we built our data strategy. So that project or program starts with detailed planning and kicking off the data governance efforts, making those technology decisions, maybe by doing proofs of concepts on different tools for different layers of that architecture that we saw earlier. Obviously then building out that architecture, building out that data repository, and building out that business intelligence layer, and then training the users, enabling them on the new tools that we're going to give them. Again, not just in those tools, but in some of the softer topics as well. And then we celebrate. Once we go live with some deliverables in the hands of our end users, we give ourselves a nice pat on the back, and we raise a glass and toast ourselves before doing it again. And then, because after then we iterate and we grow the solution and we mature it. And that can be a recurring process, because a data warehouse or an analytics environment is something that is constantly evolving and constantly growing with the organization. So other factors, by the way, to include in this plan are staff availability and whether outside help will be required, the organization's budgeting process, and also whether other major projects are happening throughout the enterprise that might prevent the right resources from participating. So once we weave all those together, we're able to present this plan, this solution with our business case to the decision makers of the organization for buy-in, for budget, and then eventually for the development of the solution. So this is a process in terms of building the data strategy that should take anywhere from 4 to 6 to maybe 8 weeks with outside help. If it's something that's done internally, kind of as a side project, so to speak, within internal resources, it may take 2 to 3 months. But I think in terms of setting expectations on the effort required here, typically what we've seen is anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. So that is the last aspect of building a data strategy. We're running up against the bottom of the hour. So before I pass it back to Tracy, I did want to share some additional resources that Analytics 8 has for your reading pleasure and viewing pleasure. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to get into the questions that were asked, but certainly would welcome some one-on-one conversations, whether via email or over the phone. And my contact information is on this last slide. So really want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for submitting questions. Sorry we're not able to get to them here today. And we look forward to having additional follow-up conversations with anyone who is interested. And with that, Tracy, I'll pass it back to you.
Cool, thank you. So just a couple of closing remarks here. So thanks again for joining today, and thank you, Dave, so much for presenting. So this presentation obviously just kind of scratched the surface when it comes to talking about data strategy, since we only had an hour and we're even running up on time now. But as Dave mentioned, there's a lot of resources on our website. We have webinars, we have blog posts. So I will send that out in a follow-up email with links to all of those resources. I also did see someone asked if we were going to be sharing slides, so I can follow up with you individually about that. We also did record this webinar, so you'll get the recording. So once again, I'll send a follow-up that has a recording to this webinar, a couple other resources, and any other questions that we didn't get to, we will follow up individually. So thank you again for joining today. Hope you have a great afternoon, and that concludes our webinar. Thanks. Bye.